This is Liberty Law Talk, part of Liberty Fund's online library of law and liberty. Your host is Liberty Fund Fellow Ryszard Legutko. Our web address is libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org. Today we are discussing with Ryszard Legutko his latest book, The Demon in Democracy, Totalitarian Temptations and Free Societies. Ryszard Legutko is professor of philosophy at Jagiellonian University in Krakow, Poland, where he specializes in ancient philosophy and political theory. In addition to being the author of numerous books and articles, he has served as the Minister of Education and the Secretary of State in the Chancellery of the late President Lech Kaczynski, and he has been Deputy Speaker of the Senate. He is currently a member of the European Parliament, Deputy Chairman of the Parliamentary Group of European Conservatives and Reformists, and he is a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee. Professor Legutko, glad to have you on the program.
Glad to be here. Thank you for having invited me.
Okay. So, my first question comes right out of the title of your book, which is provocative. What is the demon in democracy?
Well, from the very beginning, democracy was considered to be a deficient system. I mean, every political system is deficient in some degree, whether it's oligarchy or aristocracy or monarchy. Each political system is somehow lacking the qualities which are necessary for a good life. And there were several weaknesses of democracy that were described a long time ago in the antiquity and then in modern times. But somehow, from a certain moment in Western history, I think after the World War II, probably democracy became sanctified, so to speak. Democracy became not a problem that we should somehow solve or work on all the time, but democracy was considered to be the solution. And somehow we dismissed or forgot about all these warnings that had been formulated in the past by, John Stuart Mill, by Alexis de Tocqueville, by Ortega y Gasset, a lot of people who were saying, among other things, that a major problem in democracy is the tyranny of the majority, because it's the majority that rules, and not only politically, but as we learn from the books of those great thinkers, democracy is also the tyranny of thought. That is, the majority will tell you what to think, how to think, and it's very difficult to be a dissenter in a democracy, because if you are a dissenter in an authoritarian system, you usually are put on trial and put to prison. Whereas in democracy, if you are a dissenter, you are either ignored or be considered an insane person.
Yeah.
And this is one of several weaknesses. The rule of law, for example. I mean, there is an intrinsic conflict between democracy and the rule of law. I mean, if it is the majority that makes law, then the demos, the majority, can change the law at will, and each time they are the supreme authority to judge what's a good law and what is not a good law. So, and I enumerate various other problems that we have in democracy, like the fact that everything becomes political. And that has led me to a comparison which some of my friends or enemies, on that matter too, found shocking, namely that I compare liberal democracy as it exists today with communism. And these similarities are really remarkable. I do not ignore the differences. I'm quite aware that there are major differences, but what worries me is there are more and more similarities, like what I call politicization. That is, everything becomes political. That was exactly the problem that we had in a communist system. There was no area of life that you could call private, because it immediately became an object of interest and even of interference of the political power, the Communist Party, or those who control the ideology. I mean, they will tell you how you should organize your private life. I mean, that the political conflicts were reflected, so to speak, in private life or in communal life. Now you have exactly the same thing in a liberal democracy today. That is, private is the private is political, as the feminists are never tired of saying. Family became an object of political intervention, of political and ideological restructuring. There's hardly a place in a modern society that you could be free to sort of organize it as you believe is right, because you are bound by all these political and ideological rules. Like the language. I mean, that's if you remember George Orwell's 1984, the language was the first thing that the protagonist of the book sort of try to reject or become emancipated from the control of the system. And I remember from the communist times the language, official, public, but also within institutions such as the university or the school, the language was highly regulated. It was expected they would use these phrases and not other phrases. Now that's exactly what's happening now. The language is also strictly regulated. You cannot publish an article in a scholarly journal in the United States or in Europe if the language does not follow certain prescribed rules, and these are not, mind you, grammatical rules or stylistic rules. These are ideological rules. There's a certain politically loaded language that became mandatory.
Yeah.
Now that is something that if that is not what would make people reflect on the similarities between communism and today's liberal democracy, I don't know what will be.
Now let's think about this in particular. Part of this book, excuse me, seems to me deeply biographical, or a part of your personal experience as a member of Solidarity and the communist, post-communist transition in Poland into a liberal democracy. Talk about that, if you would, sort of the hopes, the aspirations that anti-communist writers and thinkers like yourself had for Poland when communism fell versus what actually happened, because it seems to me that's a vital part of your book.
Mm-hmm. Well, I come from a staunchly anti-communist family, and anti-communist background, so I never flirted with the regime, never even considered joining a communist party or anything like it. And so it became, in a way, easy for me to join the democratic opposition in Poland. I was a young scholar at the time, and we published a samizdat quarterly, where we could publish what we wanted without having the censor who would correct our incorrect language or our incorrect ideas. So that was, as I said, I never had to
Now, the samizdat,
challenge my,
the one point, the samizdat that you just referenced there, that goes to your comparison between communism and liberal democracy, does it not? That you would publish works on, surreptitiously on, thin paper, distribute them, hand to hand, to escape the censor, and yet you're saying under current free conditions, one still has to be very, very careful in how you're publishing, say, politically incorrect positions. It might have to be done in that capacity. I guess that kind of goes to your point.
Yes, of course, one shouldn't really draw this analogy very sort of point by point, because of course we live in a different system. But my sort of first moment of critical reflection was that I felt a similar stuffy atmosphere.
Chill, yeah.
That you just cannot say what you want to say, even if you argue to the best of your knowledge and try very hard to argue correctly following the rule of logic and the basis of the knowledge that you have. So I had that feeling that there are certain things that you cannot say, and even there are certain things which you cannot even think. In a communist time, I think it also goes back to Orwell, but not only him. There was a concept of thought crime. That is, your mind cannot wander freely because the crime, the political crime starts in your mind with a thought that is essentially incorrect. And so this pressure in today's world, when I started experiencing this pressure, that of course nobody used a concept of thought crime, but that was my immediate reaction, that I have to follow the line. There is a certain line. Of course, there is not a political party that makes the decision, but in a stuffy atmosphere of political coercion or political conformity, there are always people who take it as an opportunity to exert power, because it's an easy instrument of power. If you put yourself in a position of somebody who sees to it that what is being said and what is being written is correct, right? This gives you an enormous power, because if you accuse somebody, then you put this person on a defensive. That is, I have to explain why I use this word and not the other word. And so I say there is not a communist party or the equivalent of the communist party, but there are quite a lot of people who willingly take a similar role, and they have their mouth full of humanistic slogans, They talk of diversity and plurality and inclusiveness. But what they do is that they control your thoughts, and they try to control your language, the language that you use. So this is an atmosphere which many people find unbearable. And at a certain point of time, at a university, and then I moved to politics, and I saw it more broadly. But then at the university, I had this feeling that things become not as nice and as free and as fresh as I hoped they would be. The best, I would say, the best time as far as freedom is concerned, the free exchange of views, and as this fantastic sense of liberty that you have, the best time was the last days of the old regime and the first days, so to speak, of the new regime, right, of the new system. So in this moment of transition, about 1 year or 2 years, these were great times because you even felt physically, you felt this spirit of liberty, and you absolutely felt no inhibitions and no pressure from outside. You could say and you could write what you wanted. But then things were beginning to change.
Talk about. You use in the book a phrase, not just descriptively. You use it, liberal democracy. You hyphenate it to describe what democracy in the West is now. I take it, or maybe democracy in Europe. And part of the way you get into that description is right in this moment of transition in Poland. You argue that former communist and communist party members emerged and were even more capable of using the system than anti-communists were, and were seen as having more credibility, strangely enough. Talk about just sort of that and how that informs your argument, because it seems to me that's a particular part of it, that there is a style or a philosophy behind democracy that you consider illiberal.
Well, there was this strange alliance all of a sudden that was formed between the former communists and a part of the democratic opposition. Well, there are several reasons why. All of a sudden, the communist, the anti-communist opposition joined ranks with the former communists. I mean, a part of the democratic opposition and a part of the former communists. And they formed a new orthodoxy, and quite surprisingly, at least I was surprised, that they had more in common. They found more in common with each other than each of the group could find with a person like myself. Probably, I mean, there are many reasons, but they were considering to be progressive. They were considered to be modern, right? Modernizers. They were fighting the bigotry. They were fighting the backwardness. They were fighting conservatives. I mean, that's what the communists had been doing all along. I mean, they were all for progress. They were all for modernity. They were all for change, right? They wanted to restructure the world. They wanted to restructure the society. And if you take a part of the anti-communist opposition, usually inspired by the left-wing ideology, they discovered that former communists were their comrades in arms, because they joined forces and they wanted to restructure the society, make it a new, a better, modern, free from all those bad things from the past. And again, they launched a modernizing crusade. They believed themselves to be, like former communists in the past, the accoucheur of the new system, right? The society had to follow the directives. They were the leaders. They were the strategists. They were the doctors, if you will, and they will tell you that this or that. Your feeling is a symptom of a disease, so you have to be cured. And the new government and the new ideology was to make you a modern man, right, a better person. So there was this contempt for people and this enthusiasm, right, to start things anew and to construct a new society. Now, we rebelled against the communists because we did not want to be treated like patients. I mean, we had enough of being treated as an amorphous mass that can be molded according to certain political or ideological prescriptions. And this social engineering, this social engineering is what I think made these two groups allies. Mm-hmm. And they formed as I said, they formed an orthodoxy. That is, if you say no, right, if you dissented, then you were regarded as somebody who is against progress, against modernity, who is for bigotry, superstition. I mean, this simplistic language, the simplistic, highly ideological rhetoric which we know from the past, not only the communist past, but it has been employed for several centuries. I mean, if you read political pamphlets in Europe at the end of the 18th century, or if you read some writings from the first half of the 20th century, you have the same rhetoric. That is a certain group of people. They are the engineers of the human soul. They take the full responsibility for restructuring society and for performing a certain operation on the body of society.
Question for you. Communism, in the comparisons between liberal democracy and communism you draw in the book, communism very much had an end state in mind of the idea being the state withering away and equality prevailing, and there being, everything that you needed would be in abundance, so on. What's the end game for liberal democracy as you see it, given that you do draw certain comparisons? Obviously with communism, is that a comparison? Does it have an end in mind, a place it wants to take democracy?
What I write about communists is that they, sure, some of them had this idea of society, an egalitarian society, right? Equality being the paramount value and the paramount principle, the withering away of the state, as Lenin put it. But instead, they build a huge, a powerful bureaucratic structure. Because when you want to have equality, you have to have a bureaucratic a bureaucratic structure, a sort of bureaucratic despotism. This is the paradox of equality. That is, the more equality you want to have, the more you have to empower the government to make this equality secure and more entrenched. And I believe that's a possible predicament for liberal democracy. We have been building enormous power structures in order to implement the egalitarian agenda of many political groups, and the world does not become a better place to live. There is no more freedom. There is less freedom because there is this politics of implementing equality. That is, you have to control if everybody is equal. Now, if for instance, you interfere with the literary canon because you believe that the canon that has existed for centuries is an assault on the idea of equality, because there are certain writers who are not represented there. There are not enough women. There are not enough blacks. There are not enough homosexuals. Right. So you have to build a structure to make this canon acceptable. And if people resist because they still want to teach Shakespeare and not Alice Walker, the first name that comes to my mind, then you have to empower the institutions with certain political instruments to change people's attitudes, to change their aesthetic taste. Now, this of course, it sounds like a caricature, but you know that changing the canon, attacking the literary canon from the point of view of equality is not my invention, but it has been going on. So this is, as I said, this is one of several examples of what this enthronement of equality leads to.
Question for you too. You just think conceptually about liberalism and democracy. They don't necessarily have to be joined, obviously, yet you argue, I think correctly, that they are, and there's a certain ideological conception of this. But when we think about liberalism, there's obviously an aristocratic liberalism, and then there's sort of the egalitarian liberalism. You've been sort of describing that now. My question for you, you said at the beginning of the interview that democracy was sanctified after World War II. And you said that, and I nodded along, but then I thought of one reason, maybe the Cold War and fighting the Soviet Union, but another reason, it seems to me, something that's interesting, and is the European Union is also developing or coming into being after World War II, and there you see a willingness, even from the fathers of the Common Market Project, to lift politics up or to take it away from democracy. And that seems to be the way the European Union has really developed, particularly since the last 20 years, towards ever closer integration and union. How does that impacted your perception or writing about liberal democracy and this these sorts of comparisons you're drawing with communism?
Oh, well, I must admit that the experience I had in the European institutions and in the European Parliament in particular was a major inspiration for me to write this book, because I could see it unfold before my eyes. This new type of non-democratic, at the same time hyper-democratic democracy. If you want to have an illustration of what the tyranny of the majority leads to. Now you have the European Union. The European Union has been in the hands of the majority. Take the European Parliament. I mean, this is a very ingenious institution because it's a sort of political perpetual motion. That is, whatever the elections, the same coalition is in power, and they have been in power from time immemorial, and they will continue to be in power for a long time.
You're talking about the European Parliament?
I'm talking about European Parliament. There is this coalition of socialists and so-called Christian Democrats. Certainly not Christian, but
but certainly the European
and Greens.
The European Parliament, though, is maybe you're going to touch on this, isn't really where the balance of power is in the European Union. But that I think that shows you the malaise of today's democracy. That is, they believe why this majority and why no change for several reasons. But one of the most important ones is that they believe to represent the mainstream, and they are the mainstream. I mean, this is what the tyranny of majority looks like. They are the mainstream. So why should they bother with the fringes? Why should they bother with the fringe opinions? Right? They are the they are the mainstream, and that happens also in many nation states. That the left and the right seem to coalesce with a simultaneous movement to the left. So the classical opposition between left and right, which was essential for a republican system, even for a democratic republic, or for a democratic monarchy, if you will, like the Netherlands, for example, that has disappeared. So you have now the power is in the hands of the people who are indistinguishable. Mm-hmm. I mean, there are no major differences between them, and so they have this mainstream politics, and at the same time they accept that the most important decisions are taken by the supremely powerful individuals, like, for instance, the Chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany, whose role and political position and political prerogatives are not specified in the EU treaties, but she is the most important person in the European Union. So there is no contradiction between the tyranny of the majority and the one-man rule. Of course, it's not a one rule, but something. The fact that a few individuals have very much power, more than the treaties and the Constitution provide. So these things can go together, and this is, I think, what is wrong, or what went wrong in today's democracy. There is no. I was going to say, Pierre Menant describes kind of what you're talking about as the immoderate middle of European politics.
Yeah.
But it is the case. We just had Brexit 2 months ago, which seems to be a shockwave. We've got increasing numbers of people in France, in Germany, in Sweden. There's talk of an Italian exit campaign perhaps being mounted. Hungary seems to be totally flouting its will in the face of the European Union, and even your country, Poland, has a pretty conservative government in power that seems to be obviously sort of resisting the European Union on recent questions about the judiciary. So I guess my question is, though, for your analysis of liberal democracy, it does seem that increasing numbers of people are starting to question sort of this inevitable, forward march, progress, whatever you want to call it, that Europe has said that it's been under now, in the post-Cold War period. In large measure, it seems because, they're not actually finding their lives are flourishing under its rule.
That's true. There is a certain movement you can see in several countries, movement against this monopoly of power. But those who hold this monopoly, they fight back. They do not want to have any opposition. That's an interesting political construction. I mean that the opposition is illegitimate. That's another part of the analogy between liberal democracy of today and communists. So the example you mentioned in France, right, in Germany, Hungary, and Poland, they are viciously attacked by the European Union and the bureaucracy and the leaders because they are considered to be illegitimate. That's an illegitimate form of opposition. You cannot do it. If you are in the mainstream, right? If you believe yourself to represent all that is best in the world, right? The future, the past. The decency. Why should you give a right to form an opposition from somebody who apparently doesn't share these lofty ideals and probably is a very bad person? So yes, this is this. You can look at what's happening in Europe for some time as on the one hand a revolt. I mean, people, more and more people are fed up with what has been going on, and on the other hand, you have the EU showing its teeth, right, and its claws, and threatening the dissenters with all sorts of reprisals and.
But also revealing itself to be, in certain respects, basic questions, impotent. It seems to me completely unable to deal with the migrant situation, which stems from a basic structural principle in the European Union that relatively no policing of the external borders of the European Union, and yet with the Schengen Accord, complete movement within. So now you've got as you're living much more than I am, experiencing this sort of migrant crisis. You've also got the terrorist crisis, as well as fiscal problems, where the European Union, in the face of its own rules, allowed countries like Greece into the Union. And so it seems to me, insofar as the European Union, I think, is a vital part of the liberal democracy you're talking about, it's if not failing, it's certainly not gathering steam.
Well, I think it's failing. Yes, yeah, I think it's failing, and the leaders of the European Union and the EU bureaucracy and the political class, almost in its entirety, I think, are trapped by their own ideology. They cannot really. They do not know what to do. I mean, clearly there are. Symptoms. So there is hard empirical evidence that the euro system is failing. That it was a bad decision, and Greece is one of several examples that prove. But also Italy, also Spain, and yet they cling to this ideological concept. No, the euro system must continue to exist. They could have kept great Britain in the EU had they been more flexible, but they were not. I mean, there is this ideological stubbornness which make them immune to facts. So I think it's failing. It's failing, which is a shame, because there are several things I think that we benefited from, and several good ideas like a single market, right, on opening the borders. But you cannot have all these things if you do not act prudently. That is, if you do not behave rationally. Now, opening the borders for immigrants without being aware how many immigrants they will be coming. This willkommen policy of Chancellor Merkel. Yeah. And she's not a newcomer to politics. She's a tough politician, experienced, and she made this mistake, and she had the support of her party, of the public opinion. Now she's losing it, but still she clings to this old belief that it was a right decision. No, it provoked a backlash, and we will live with the consequences. And nobody knows what to do with the immigration crisis, because probably there is no possible solution available to the human mind, right? Perhaps some more superhuman power would be able to solve the problem, but certainly politicians who are all too human, I would say, will have to live with it, and the societies are getting more and more impatient. So yes, the EU is failing, primarily because there was no fresh air that people could freely talk, discuss, and make the good decision that was imposed on them from above.
You know, I mean, it's interesting you were saying the sort of illegitimacy label being placed on those, questioning the mainstream of the EU, of whatever line is coming out, and yet, but when you're defeated soundly in a national referendum, like Brexit, which no one thought the opposition could win. The markets were roiled because no one had even placed proper financial bets on the prospect of a Leave vote winning. I mean, that's one way one can deal with that sort of illegitimacy label is, those who are somewhat detached from the people they govern are actually forced to lose at polls. I wanted to, maybe end. So your book draws comparisons. It's a difficult book. It'll be a difficult book for many to read, between liberal democracy and communism and sort of various features. But I take it you're not opposed to democracy as such when it's anchored by constitutionalism, and when there is proper allowance for maybe pre-democratic institutions to flourish in the society, like religion, like the family, like local rule and property rights, and all of these things. But this is what precisely you're saying liberal democracy wants to reshape even these institutions.
Well, there are certain solutions, I think, which are good solutions, like universal suffrage, free elections. I mean, there hasn't been so far a better way of securing the peacefulness of the transition of power. That doesn't mean that the public makes always good decisions. Doesn't mean that sometimes the leader goes against the public and is right. But this is certainly the best solution we've had so far. But my problem is that this is a solution which is applicable to politics, and I cannot cannot say that elections is the institution that is applicable everywhere, or sort of universal suffrage. I do not believe it works in education. I do not believe it works in the churches. In art, right? In culture.
So we recognize the limits of democracy. We are, as Tocqueville said, we are modest defenders of democracy, I think you're saying.
Yes, and I believe that also we have to be aware that there are certain important ideals in public life which democracy jeopardizes, like the rule of law. And we've seen it more than once that the law has become an object of this inter-party strife and was changed at will to satisfy short-term political interest. And well, there are other things that other deficiencies of democracy that have to be analyzed, like education. I mean, if you look at history, the best schools were formed in aristocratic societies. In democracy has been unable to produce good schools. They are living on the quality schools that were given to the democratic society by the past. Probably that is the explanation is equality. That the democracy is too much preoccupied with equality, and education is essentially inegalitarian, right? It's
yes.
It's hierarchical. So we have to be aware of these limitations. I quote a very well-known sentence by Winston Churchill, right, about this. Democracy is good, but
for every other system out there, yeah.
Yeah. But so we have to remember that this is not the best system, that it has certain weaknesses, and we have to correct those weaknesses. And sometimes democracy is not a solution. I think it's good for a society if there are hierarchical institutions. It's good for a society that they see, for instance, the Catholic Church, which is a non-democratic institution, because there is also some value in a non-democratic institution. It will not solve. It is not good for securing the transition of power and providing the legitimacy of government. We know that. But it makes us aware that hierarchy is important. That, for instance, hierarchy in art, right? Hierarchy in culture, hierarchy in human excellence, hierarchy in virtue. So if we believe that all hierarchy is illegitimate and everything has to be democratic, then we wind up abolishing the literary canon, right? Or
we
accept the opinion there is no difference between the Beatles and Mozart, right, or Beethoven.
Yeah. Well, no. Ryszard, thank you so much for your time. We've been talking with author Ryszard Legutko about his latest book, The Demon in Democracy. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
This is your host, Richard Greinch, and you have been listening to a podcast that can be found at libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, and find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org.